Russian President Vladimir Putin warned that the combination of sanctions, trade barriers, and a lack of trust could lead to an unprecedented global crisis at last week's St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. In fact, those challenges are what Russia faced in recent years, especially tough sanctions coming from the West. Despite setbacks, though, Russia's economy managed to grow with better transnational cooperation. Kirill Dmitriev is the CEO of Russia Direct Investment Fund. President Putin awarded him the Order of Alexander Nevsky for his contribution to international investment projects in behalf of Russia. His fund acts as a catalyst for working alongside global investors, including companies coming from U.S. allies such as Saudi Arabia and Japan. It also has many Chinese partners on the back of stronger economic ties. Let's listen to what Mr. Dmitriev had to say to us in St. Petersburg. Mr. Dmitriev, what a wonderful pleasure to have you on CGTN.
Thank you so much for having me.
We have noticed over the years, particularly recent years, Russia has been developing close relationship with some of the unlikely partners. Japan, France, even Saudi Arabia, all of which U.S. allies. How does that work?
Well, I think people understand that Russia is a very stable, consistent partner. And all you have to do is to show Russia respect and understand, you know, its policy, its approaches, and people get along with Russia great. And I think Saudi Arabia is a very interesting example, because we were completely different, we didn't have many discussions, and then we had a great event, actually at this forum 3 years ago. So then Deputy Crown Prince and now Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, came to Russia. He really saw beautiful St. Petersburg. He had a great meeting with President Putin, and they agreed to start restoring the relationship. Since then we've done an oil deal, we had lots of investments, and really we now have very good, solid relationship with Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia people.
But people really wonder whether those relationships are based on the current situation, which is sanctioned by the West against Russia.
No, I think they're much broader. Our alliance with Saudi Arabia is much more strategic. We are two, you know, of the largest oil producers in the world. It's a strategic alliance. With Prime Minister Abe, we just had a great session, and it was about how we can connect Japanese technology to the Russian market. Of course, partnership with China is absolutely key for us. We want to be part of a One Road, One Belt initiative. We want to work with China. It has nothing to do with the current, you know, relationship with the U.S. or tactical issues. It's much more strategic. Russia wants to be a good partner.
Much more strategic, particular trade and economic ties. That seems to be part of your job description. But you have noticed over the years, it used to be trade and economic ties being the pillar of the bilateral relations. That's true for many partnerships. But now you realize, that is not the strongest part. Actually, it could become the most fragile part, given, for example, what is going on between China and the United States, the trade dispute, Europeans and Americans as well. So, will that partnership be able to naturally prosper? That is the big question mark, without the influence much of geopolitics.
Yes, and the key word, of course, is trust. And really understanding each other and having dialogue. And those are basic things. But it's amazing that nations now don't do it much. And China is very respectful. I think Japan is very respectful. Russia is respectful, and I think in that dialogue lots of things could come out. And it seems like a very sort of high-level discussion, but I think it's very relevant, because if one country like the U.S., you know, does lots of sanctions, does lots of things, it may be good tactically, even though I believe it's very bad tactically, but it definitely undermines belief in dollar. We have a big discussion about people wanting to do exchanges in their own currencies, and frankly it really undermines dollar as a reserve currency. So we see that, I'm sure countries will definitely work well together through partnerships, through good strategic alliances, and China, by its inclusivity, is showing a perfect example of this.
If I remember right, Chinese Vice President Wang Qishan was saying in St. Petersburg that trust comes from implementing your target as you promised to your partners.
Yes.
And that, I guess, is very crucial. Trust and respect does not just come from anywhere. It comes from one's own actions, and actions following the words. Lagarde, Ms. Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF, also suggesting that political leaders these days, what they really need to do is to walk the talk. Some say Russia is also having some challenges in that regard. What do you think?
Well, I think it's true that, you know, we have some targets and some are fulfilled, like macroeconomic targets. Russia has very strong macroeconomy, 5.1% unemployment, you know, 2.5% inflation, etc. Other targets, such as diversifying away from oil, are sort of, we are pursuing them, we are going after them. But for example, in the ease of doing business, Russia moved up a lot in rankings. But again, we are also thinking about our own fund. And we have very specific metrics. One of those metrics is return. And we are producing 10 to 15% return annually in dollars for our partners every year for the last 6 years.
You guys did very good job, I have to say, RDIF, and that's why your name has been repeatedly mentioned by many speakers, including at the plenary session by the president. But the question is about the oil deal, for example, and about future commitment by Russia to do infrastructure building. That's promised by the president for his term this time. And you said RDIF is going to support that cause. But the question is still the credibility issue. If people invest in Russia, they want to make sure the investment is not going in vain.
Yeah, and that's why we have partnerships with 20 countries. We deployed 20 billion with them, and we got good return, and none of our partners, you know, lost money on the portfolio of their investments. And it's very difficult to keep this. We are very conservative in our approach. But again, now when people say theoretical questions, etc., about Russia, we just say, look at returns. Returns are much better than any indices of S&P 500, of other countries, etc., and that's our answer. So what we believe is important for Russia to do, if every organization, like our fund, like state corporations, do their job, then at the end of the day, the whole performance will be much stronger, and President is going to drive it. And his agenda is to improve quality of Russian people, is to have more investments, and you see actually quite a bit of change. Lots of people in state companies are changing. President is more and more clear on need to have more investments, so Ministry of Finance will put more money into investments, and we see actually this transformation. It doesn't come overnight, but it's a very serious, important transformation, and China has been very successful in driving its transformation. And frankly, Russia has a lot to learn from China's experience, from China's growth, from China's infrastructure investment, and from China's technology commitment.
Right. There is the possibility of setting up a specific fund, according to the president of Russia, for infrastructure building specifically. And people wonder what is going to be the relationship between that fund and yours. Infrastructure, you're already doing it. So how would investors choose, make their choice?
Yeah, I think first of all, our fund will also be expanded and may even also take this fund with us, etc. Or if that fund is going to be doing capital grants, money that doesn't have to be returned, then it can be separate. And basically that infrastructure fund will be giving out free money necessary for investors like ours to make good return. So we are thinking about different structures. Government involves us in decision-making process. It's a very transparent decision-making process. And what's important is that with China Investment Corporation, with other key partners, we've built great funds, great teams, great processes that lead to good returns. And basically that is very relevant to government transformation, and we are asked a lot about how to increase investment in infrastructure, in which forums and structures to use to benefit Russian people.
All right. And we understand over the past few years, when the so-called Western sanction put on Russia, your traveling schedule was still hectic. I don't know how you survived it, talking to your partners around the globe. But now, what is likely to be the way of doing the business, because we see Russia survives and even thrives under sanctions, Western sanctions.
Well, I'll give you very interesting statistics. It was published in a Saudi newspaper, Arab News, on the front page. That if you ask young people of the Arab world who is their friend, 10% used to say it's Russia. Now it's 24. Whereas in the US, 25 people thought US was their friend, and now it's 14. So in the Middle East, Russia became much more of a perceived friend of the Middle East than the US in 2 years.
But of course, Syria could be an interesting issue in which the image of Russia can be, in a way, tricky.
Well, yes and no, because Russia showed its consistency and commitment and stopped war in Syria, and now there is ceasefire. So it actually, showed that by consistent measures it accomplished certain goals. And again, I don't know all of the details, but all I can say is that the statistics of Russia's growing influence in the Middle East is there. So I think what's important is that because Russia is consistent in its approach, is building partnerships with China, with Japan, with Europe, etc., I think is going to have a good relationship with the US as well. Because I think the US needs to understand that Russia can be a good partner. We need to have this dialogue. So actually I'm a big positive believer that in the next couple of years we'll be able to come to a better understanding, even with the current administration, or
What is backing this wish?
Well, I think it's an understanding that the world is so complicated. We have so many moving parts. We have common threats like terrorism, etc. We really need to work together to solve those issues. And frankly, the amount of time we spent on negative issues is just not worth it.
But it seems that your president, Mr. Putin, at the opening, rather at the plenary session of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, he was saying something else. He was complaining to Mr. Macron, the president of France, saying, if the U.S. domestic political cycle is really driving the world to the extent that it is today, for example, whether WTO is still relevant, for example, unilateral sanctions will be the way to go, that is going to, in a way, threaten the future of the world. He's not as optimistic as you are at all.
Yeah, no, and I think his point, of course, is very valid. And we want to not have that. Because basically, if every 4 years, a new US president can come in and change all of the treaties, and this is what the president was talking about, of course, it's very dangerous. So this is why we need to go back to much more Chinese approach of long-term planning, of inclusivity, and that's a much better way of addressing it. And again, we see it through Belt Road Initiative, we see it through much more inclusive approach, and people really appreciate it. And what we see, many people want actually to go use Chinese institutions, they want to have transactions in renminbi, they're actually interested in Chinese approach, so we hope that doesn't change.
For the West, the question they always ask is, what is this nature of partnership between China and Russia? Probably you could help us to understand better. I mean, if you see China and the United States is having a trade dispute, even though some people could even use the exaggerated term trade war, you also see United States and Russia not necessarily on a great term. There are still sanctions unilaterally coming from one country to one another. So what exactly is the nature of relationship between China and Russia today? Is that sustainable?
Well, I think there are many levels. First of all, we have great relationship between our leadership, and this is based, I believe, on respect. And respect is very important because, when we look at a situation, we don't try to go and punish somebody. We go and try to understand what are the issues, how we can solve it, what is the way to address it, etc. And we believe it's by far better approach. If US feels it's so strong, it can go and punish people left and right, frankly, it's not very sustainable. I believe what's very good about Russia-China relationship is based on mutual respect, It's based on dialogue.
Yeah.
It's based on, you know, if you don't agree on something, let's discuss why and find a compromise,
Yeah.
and that's the way for the future.
One of the most important questions I need to ask you is about the upcoming presidential visit of Russia to China, and later follow up by the summit of the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I understand you are accompanying your president to China. What is going to be the mission for this time? Because the two leaders, China and Russia, meet pretty often, one could see. What is going to be the mission this time, particularly at a time when so much uncertainty around us?
Yeah, well, of course, there are geopolitical issues and political issues, because there are lots of conflicts in the world, including the Korean issue, the Iran issue, and I think there will be a dialogue on geopolitics, which is very important for stability. But there's definitely going to be a very strong dialogue on trade and investments.
Yes.
And investments is a big part. We have Russia-China Fund has been investing quite a bit, and we need more successful Russian-China projects. And we're building the first bridge between Russia and China, but literally maybe we have, you know, 30 projects right now that are going on Russia-China. We need to have 300. And I think the really big important question is how do you scale up the investment engagement? How do you actually get China to be much more of a invest in Russian infrastructure and other things like that?
How? What is the solution, you think?
Well, I think the solution is having success stories like we have with Russia-China Fund. I think it's having institutions such as RDIF to be a good local partner, and it's the macroeconomic stability that Russia provides and really understanding of that by Chinese investors.
Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's also where the president's going to do and also going to go for the summit. That also has a lot to do with trade and economic ties these days, beyond what used to be only security issues. So if I could ask you about the potential of that platform for Russia, what would you say?
I think it's very important. And it's based on dialogue, it's based on inclusivity, it's based on working with different countries in the region.
Yes.
So I think that dialogue and importance has been growing. Lots of One Belt, One Road initiatives are also being discussed, and
Eurasian Economic
Union integration. So it's a very good platform to discuss economic inclusivity in the region.
You think the president will have a lot of proposals for his Chinese counterpart?
Well, I think it's about Eurasia Union with One Belt, One Road initiatives. There will be a number of proposals.
It's such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
At the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for taking your time.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Kirill Dmitriev, that is CEO of Russia Direct Investment Fund, talking to us on the sideline of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo, all different kinds of social platforms. So from me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.